Good morning and welcome to our latest webinar. Today we're talking about buying software. With reports that up to 40% of software purchases are quickly regretted, today we want to talk about some of the common mistakes that we see and debate if we can avoid these pitfalls and discuss the consequences of buying the wrong solution. We'll also discuss how by following a few important steps during the buying process, you can hugely improve your outcomes. So to talk about this today, I'm joined by Gary Jones, who has been helping service companies buy and implement software for over 20 years, and Steve Lindsay, who's at the cold face of this process daily in his role as a software consultant. So good morning, guys.
Morning, ladies and gents.
Morning, Steve.
So why did you feel that this would be a good topic for a webinar discussion?
It's a good question. I think because it's just something that people don't often talk about. I think from our perspective, we're always seen as the bad guy in many respects because we are a software vendor. So when we actually talk to prospects or people that are interested in implementing something like a service management system or an ERP system or an accounting solution, whatever it is, well, that's not something that they do every day. It might be, if you're looking back to on-prem solutions, which a lot of people still use, like every 10 or 15 years, you might consider changing your software supplier. So no matter how experienced you are with technology, actually going through the buying process is something that people don't do very often. Whereas on our side of it, we go through it all the time. It is essentially our job is helping people choose the right one. You get this disconnect where you've got a prospect who wants to buy software and a salesperson of any description who wants to sell software. And there's a disconnect there's a perceived disconnect between their motivations. So the prospect doesn't trust the salesperson because they think they have a vested interest. But the salesperson, and this is where we're getting to, I suppose, with our discussion later, is the salesperson feels as though the prospect doesn't lead the conversation well enough. And like I say, it's not something that we've talked about very often. So from my perspective, and I know it's a particular bugbear, Steve, because we talked about it a lot, we thought, well, let's just lay it out on the table and have an honest discussion about it. That's how we got to where we are now.
Okay, so let's get into the meat of the question then. Given that companies don't buy this type of software very often, or at least they hope not to, how on earth do they boil down all the options out there to find a solution that will actually work for them? Given that the buyer's perception is the sales guy has a vested interest in selling you their solution rather than you taking somebody else's.
I think it's probably worth taking a little bit of a step back and highlighting some of the things that I hear when I'm talking to companies that are looking to select a new software platform, looking to improve processes. So we often, what we've got here is a slide with just some sound bites, really, of things that I hear on a daily basis when talking to companies for the first time. And I think, like Gary mentioned, it's a little bit of a bugbear of mine. It's something that I think there's a better way for people to engage with us to get the best results for both them and for us as well. So I think Gary mentioned people don't do this every day. They've often been involved in projects where they've not been successful because they've not selected the right technology, or it's not been well implemented or well adopted. The people haven't used it correctly. So, and I think it's all these those sort of issues come out of how you engage the relationship between the company and the vendor from the start. So what I hear all the time is, the first stage is, can you give me a demo, please? And that's completely understandable because I think, again, we've mentioned that companies don't buy software every day. So they almost need education, or they're looking to understand what's possible with a service management platform. And then they'll use that to drive their requirements. So, we'll get requested that. And I know they may have seen some other software demonstrations, and they've seen I don't know the right word, but I call it sexy or shiny. Shows you I'm a bit of a nerd, really. But they see something, the functionality, which looks really impressive, really sexy, but it might actually not deliver what they want as a business or even solve their problems. So I think, that's the first stage, is where things can start to go wrong by letting the software lead the conversation.
Yeah, I think it does come back to that. It comes back to that trust element as well. It's how do you move from a situation where the prospect needs advice, understandably. So someone wanting to buy software, they're looking for an expert. They want someone to help them figure out how they do it and what's the process that they should go through. But a lot of salespeople, they are overtaken by that self-interest. So when somebody says to them, as Steve said, can you do a demonstration of your software? They go, yeah, that's great. Because actually they buy into the idea that, there's going to be this beauty parade. And as Steve said, that then the person with the software will then start to formulate in their mind what it is that they want or what their business needs based on what they're shown. And what we're saying is, well, no, that's not the right way. It should be the other way around. But if they're not doing that on a regular basis, how does that, how do you get to that point? So, it sounds a bit harsh, but you get a situation like the proverbial blind leading the blind. To coin the cliche, it's people with self-interest trying to direct people who are unsure about what to do, and they end up taking them down a direction that they don't want to go in. And that's when you mentioned at the outset about 40% of people suffer software purchases. They suffer some kind of buyer's regret afterwards. And I suppose what we're highlighting here is the reasons why that number is just so high.
Sorry, on.
So and I think I've probably put this in a very stronger words or stronger phrase, but I think it's almost negligent, to use the analogy of a doctor and a patient, to prescribe a solution without really understanding what the patient's symptoms are. And I think, there's probably a bit of a stretch to that sort of analogy, but I see this as the same process. Unless you sit down with the company, understand what problems they're having, what issues that are resulting because of that, and what they're looking to achieve. How can you dictate what's a good fit for them or not? And I know, so talk about ourselves a little bit, but part of our process, I think, is being very honest with clients. And if we don't have a fit, then we won't even show you the software. There's no point. It doesn't benefit anybody in the long term.
Yeah. Okay. So, Gary mentioned buyer's regret briefly. So, is that where the buyer's perception comes from then? So, say a sales guy is pulling the wool over somebody's eyes just to try and get the sale, and do you think that might be one of the consequences?
Well, look, salespeople get a bad rep, but they're just normal people. They're like everybody else. They're just trying to do their job to the best of their ability. They're not. Salespeople are never deliberately deceptive, certainly not in my last experience. But it goes back to what we said earlier. It's just because they do have a vested interest. So if you go through the beauty parade and the sales guy shows a piece of software, and as Steve alluded to, you've got that kind of the big shiny object syndrome where they latch onto a piece of functionality, and they say, "Well, that's great." Then they start pushing. Then the prospect or the buyer will then start pushing the salesperson down the route of, "Well, that's great. I like the look of that. How much is it?" And then you get into the price conversation, and then it's a push towards making a decision. I'm sure Steve will come onto it later, but that's why most situations that you get in it when you've got that kind of buyer-seller relationship, that the ultimate outcome is that nothing happens, no purchase is made, and that's because they've not been through this process correctly. So at some point, the feeling that the justification for making the purchase is never going to be there because you've not addressed, as Steve said, you've not diagnosed the issues. So at some point, that realization or that uneasy feeling about that will come to the fore. And sometimes they can't even verbalize what it is that makes them feel uneasy about pushing the button. So they end up doing nothing.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think I've got another slide here with bubbles. And I think if you go through that process, the traditional process, there's there's some frustrations or results as that come out of it, and Gary mentioned one there, is that often people, when we're engaging with them, are looking at solving their own problems. They're it's very frustrating. They're spending lots of time doing a particular process, or they're getting their backside kicked every month because they can't give a report, or so they're in a world where they're trying to look and solve their own problems, which is absolutely valid, but they don't involve other people in the business to understand what they're trying to achieve, and even from a wider scale, what the business as a whole is looking to achieve, whether that's sell more, reduce cost, reduce risk or compliance. So there's often a disconnect with people trying to solve their own problems and the overall aims of the business, and unless you can connect the two, often the project won't go ahead because it's unclear what the value is across the business. But if it does go ahead, then projects are often don't meet expectations because there's some misalignment there. There's no way of measuring what success looks like.
You've got it in there, Steve. Sorry to interrupt, but like software that lacks key functionality, I can see on your slide, and it is as basic as that. That when we're talking about pitfalls or consequences of the first part of the conversation, it's amazing how many times you would see that. A lot of that 40% that we talked about at the outset of buyer regret will be people have got to the implementation stage and realized that some pretty core key functionality that they require is missing. And, rightly so, people will look at that and think, how on earth have you ever got to that situation? Mm-hmm. Well, it's for all the reasons that we talked about in the first 10 minutes of the discussion, in that people go off on a tangent looking at functionality that really isn't core to the business. Yeah, it's a nice to have, and yeah, it adds some value. But actually, did you go through the process of documenting what are the core requirements? What are the daily processes the business does? And where do you really add value? Where are the improvements to be made? Which, as Steve rightly said, that you can some point measure moving forward. It's amazing how often that issue of lacking key functionality only comes out in the implementation stage.
So basically the focusing on on what's pretty in the software, what looks nice, rather than the functionality that they need. That makes a lot of sense.
You're right with your battery there, Steve.
Yeah,
you don't want to lose you partway through the discussion. You're the one with the slideshow.
drop off a cliff.
What you're saying, right, Adrian, is correct. It is really easy. It's human nature, isn't it? It's human nature to get drawn to things that, drawn to things that look nice. It is human nature, and unless you've got some kind of process, which is, I guess, what we're getting to is, unless you've got something at the core of that decision making or that judgment that you're making, that you can pull it back to the center ground and say, okay, yeah, that is great, and that does look really nice, that would add some value, but actually bringing it back to the core, have I made sure that all of these things have been addressed?
Yeah, okay.
I think it's difficult as well. From obviously we've been in the service management, field service, software arena for 30 years, and we deal with lots of different companies. But so we know a lot of the typical challenges that they have, but it's surprising how differently people in the same sector, same industry do things. So it's very difficult for us to understand, what they're really trying to get out of the software. What are the key things for them, without either being told that or at least discussing it and bringing that during the conversations.
Okay, so if we know that's what's happening, how do we make it better in the future? How do we prevent that from happening?
Okay, so what we've got here is a process that we endeavor to follow with the companies that we deal with. There's lots of boxes on here, but it is a simple process. It doesn't have to be a full science project. So I made another analogy is, even when you're buying a £5 piece of software or a new app on your mobile phone, you make a decision on what am I trying to achieve? Why am I buying it? What's the best one out there? As a typical bloke thing to do is look at the details. So what's the best solution, and how do I use it? And I think that's
for people looking at home, obviously one of the boxes is obscured by our beautiful faces. So what's the box at the bottom?
I think that these three boxes here are the start of the process. So it's jointly working together with the company and the vendor to understand how things are done currently, what the issues with those current processes are, what impact that has. So what the users are doing at their own level, but also what's the management team, what's the owner of the business, what does he want to do with the business, and can we align those? And I think the box that's obscured at the bottom is the justification and improved outcomes. So, why are we buying the software and what is the business case for this? So nowadays, money's always been tight and being able to demonstrate a return, but it's now more true than ever. Is having a real key understanding about what is the value, what is the payback.
So I take it that the first group of boxes under why change is literally that, isn't it? It's let's take a step back. Why do we want to change what we're doing now? Basically, what's going wrong, or what do we want to achieve? And why ultimately.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, yeah. I mean, they're nicely listed, those, but fundamentally, what we're talking about is getting to a point where everybody understands the motivations for it, and that as the buyer, that you've understood not just your own personal motivation, which often clouds the justification to the rest of the business, but that you form the justifications across the whole business as well.
Okay, so essentially everything in that first group of boxes under why change is what is the first part of that process. So it's let's understand what we're doing at the moment, how we're doing it, what we want to achieve, who needs to be involved in that process, really. And that's summarizing essentially the first part of that entire buying process.
Yeah, and that drives the rest of the process, really. So when that's why change is clear, then that will drive what is the functionality we need in a software package to help meet these requirements from a business point of view. So once you've got those, and I always advise people, whether they do it together with us or themselves, is to put them on paper. So there's no ambiguity. It's clear that when you're assessing what's the best solution, that you can pull it back to these are the core things that we need the software to do. So it's those functions. So rather than jumping into, please show me a software demonstration and going straight to here, when we do a demonstration, that it's actually aligned with the requirements that you want, to the things that are relevant to you as a business, the things that are important for you, the things that are going to have a benefit to you.
That's really important part of the process, because it goes back to what we was, it's all linked. It's making sure that you are true to those core requirements that the business needs and where the main improvements are, and that you're not distracted by, the big shiny object. That's really important. Incidentally, Adrian, are you paying me rights for using my avatar in this image, by the way?
I did mention that to our marketing team.
I think the other one looks a bit like you, Adrian, just with a wig on. But yeah. So the other thing as well, I'd like to highlight from this slide is this upfront work. Just spending a little bit of time understanding the why change sort of drives everything, not just what's the best solution, but when you selected the best solution, when you start to implement this and look at getting results, understanding what the clear aims are help convince the business, the users, people that naturally don't like change. They don't like, it's a pain in the backside to move to a new software package and learn how to navigate around it and so on. But if it's clear why the business is doing it and why they're moving, then the getting the users and bringing the user along is a lot easier. And the other thing that I always try and go through with companies to deal with is, at the end of 6 months, 12 months after we've implemented a solution, how can we stand in front of the management team, in front of the business, and say these are the clear things that have been a benefit that we aim to do and we've actually achieved from a project, and if they haven't achieved them, why haven't we achieved them, and can we rectify them? So this is the last box on the slide, but it's directly sort of linked to the first why change, and I think it's often get missed, and sometimes I know Gary's mentioned before that often people implement the software and then 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line, they sort of losing focus on why they changed in the first place.
Well, yeah. The other thing, I was just going to say, sorry, Adrian, to interrupt. I was just going to say the other thing to mention there is you've also got what we say is what we class as unintended consequences of both positive and negative. And quite often, if you've not gone through this process and you're not able, as Steve rightly said, to be able to then measure them based on what you agreed before you went through the process, then actually people start measuring success on the unintended consequences of the implementation, and that's all they ever factor in. It's like, well, actually, this was a negative experience in this aspect because there was a knock-on effect of X, Y, and Z. Actually, that ability to measure and report positive outcomes and positive benefits actually means you negate any of the other unintended consequences that somebody might challenge you about in the business.
Okay. Stephen, we've had a question from one of the webinar viewers. So they're asking and it's going back to a part of the earlier process, who's best placed to build the functional requirements?
In some ways, I'm not sure it really matters, as long as somebody does that work and puts it in writing. So we often go through this process with the companies we deal with. Some people do it themselves if they've got capability in-house and expertise and resource in-house to do it. Some people employ a third party, such as a consultant, in that process. So it's in some ways it doesn't matter who does it, as long as I'd strongly advise people to do it.
Yeah. I think in my experience, I think it can be one of two things that can happen. You can be speaking to somebody who might be part of the management team, but what they've not done when you've gone through the demonstration process, they've not spoken to the users of the system, and sometimes they can get a kickback from the users because they've not really drilled into the detail as to what they need on a day-to-day basis. Do you find that happens often?
I think it's absolutely the best case to involve whoever's touches the system from start to finish during the process. And I think getting feedback, whether it's a workshop with the users to understand, what goes on a day-to-day basis, because that's often where, a lot of the time and errors or the frustrations are at that operational level. So understanding the detail of that and having a plan to overcome it is absolutely core to it.
I suppose you can understand a lot more of the return on investment if you get down to that level, because if it's taking somebody 20 minutes to input data into a system, but introducing a new system might remove that time, then that's a clear benefit of moving to a particular package, I suppose. So if you're not getting down to that detail and they're not involved in the writing of that functional requirement document, I guess you could be missing the bigger picture of what you're actually getting from the system.
Okay. Yeah, agreed. Just going back to the original question, I think from my point of view, I would echo what Steve said. Really, as long as it's done and it's done well, it doesn't really matter who does it. Ideally, it probably would be somebody in the business that has the experience and is able to go around different stakeholders, people that have a vested interest in the business, and say, look, if we go through this process, what is it you want? What does your day-to-day operation look like? Where can we make improvements? And kind of collect those. But the other thing is, as Steve rightly said, we do it with our prospects. We want to go through this process with them, and we will do it on their behalf, because actually what a lot of people don't realize from the sales side of it is it benefits us as well. So there's actually a benefit for us, not just responding to that request for a demonstration, going back to the start. If we push back against that and say, actually, no, that's not the right way to do it, there's a benefit there for us, because otherwise we just get involved in conversations with possibly people that are not suitable for us. And really, genuinely, despite the fact that we do have a vested interest in it, we want to spend our time with people that are appropriate for us. And if they're not, we want them to be spending time with suppliers that are appropriate for them. So there's a two-way benefit for that. It's pointless trying to put a square peg in a round hole, even from the salesperson's perspective.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, I think we're pretty much up with regards to the time. So thanks, guys. Well, hopefully this has been of use to anyone looking at buying business software. If you have any questions at all, then please feel free to contact us at Service Genie. And thank you very much. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Cheers.
Take care.
Cheers, gents. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.